to be part of another webinar, which is the latest in a series of webinars that have been held by the Movement for Liberation from Nakba. Today, as we've just heard, we are going to deal with the politics of persecution, focusing on Christians in the Middle East, Christian communities in the Middle East, and how they relate to empire and what that means, for not just minorities, but for the wider society in which they live. We have a very distinguished panel with us this afternoon, evening, morning, depending on what part of the world you're from. I happen to be speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia, on a very hot day, a series of very hot days, and more in store for us, for better or for worse. We have, as I was about to say, a very distinguished panel. We have Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb, Professor Ilan Pape, and Dr. Chandra Muzaffa, and I'll have a word more to say about them in a moment. Let me begin by saying a word about the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, or MLN for short. It's a network that was bringing together organizations and individuals from different parts of the world, in particular South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, UK, Australia, New Zealand, but other parts of the world too. And with one express purpose, which is to raise awareness, raise understanding of the history of Palestine, the 1948 Nakba and its aftermath, the situation of the Palestinian minority inside Israel, and then the Palestinian people still in the West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip, and the plight of millions of Palestinian refugees in different parts of the world. So it is a project that very much stands in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation. And beyond that, it is inspired by and wishes to promote the idea of liberation more widely from colonial oppression, wherever it occurs, in its various forms, within and between countries, based very much on the principles of justice, compassion, and the dignity of the human person, which unfortunately, in many parts of the world, as we all know, are in short supply at this time. Our topic today is of particular interest because it touches upon the perspectives, the situation of relatively small Christian minorities, but they, in this part of the world, the Middle East, but obviously they have an important role. They represent one of the three major Abrahamic faiths, all of which had their birth in the Middle East. They raise very much the question of how these three faiths, how they live up to their extraordinary ethical and spiritual nobler foundations, the extent to which, how they do it, and the extent to which they might be able to do it together. I'm sure the questions we will be dealing with, we will be addressing during this webinar, will very much focus on what religion, in this case, Christian faith, can do by way of standing in support of liberation and calling into question the foundations, the principles, and the interests that lie behind imperial power. And it raises the other question, whether and to what extent Christians and Muslims and Jews of faith and principled persuasion, understanding the highest ethics of their respective faiths, which have great similarities and in many ways overlap, can come together in order to promote the principles, the values, and the reality of liberation and what that means for resistance to empire. Well, that is, of course, a rather big agenda. We may not be able to do justice to all of it, but I'm sure our three speakers, and in particular our guest speaker, will have very interesting insights to share on this question. So without further ado, let me introduce the Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb. He's the founder and president of Dar al-Kalima University College of Arts and Culture in Bethlehem. He's a widely published Palestinian Christian theologian. He received his doctorate in theology from the Philipps University at Marburg, Germany. He's the author or editor of some 40 books, including The Cross of Context, Suffering and Redemption in Palestine, Faith in the Face of Empire, The Bible Through Palestinian Eyes, and I Am a Palestinian Christian, Bethlehem Beseeched. His books and numerous articles have been translated into many languages. He has served as senior pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem between 1987 and 2017. Served as senior pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church served as president of the Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, 2011-2016. And in 2018, he was elected to the Palestinian National Council and to the Palestinian Central Council. He's founded a number of NGOs, including the Christian Academic Forum for Citizenship in the Arab World. He's a founding board member of the National Library of Palestine and a founding member and author of Kairos Palestine. He's the recipient of numerous awards and a frequent contributor to international media outlets. So as you can see, we are very privileged to have the contribution of Dr. Mitri. So it's with great pleasure that I invite you to address us.
Good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Joe, for this introduction. And it's a pleasure and honor to be with you all, my colleagues here on the webinar, but also many friends who are joining us across the globe. But I'm especially glad that we have really a focus this time on Asia. This is for me always special. I will start with a PowerPoint that I would like to use. The Politics of Persecution, Middle Eastern Christians in an Age of Empire, which is basically to share with you some of the maybe most important theses I have in my newest book that came just last September at Baylor University Press in the USA. Allow me to start maybe with a few comments. You know, the Christians in the Middle East are indigenous. This is where it's all started. And actually, I don't like to use the word Middle East that much because it's a European colonial construct from the 19th century. When you hear Middle East, you ask yourself, middle of where and east of what? It's only if you live in Europe, this part of the world will be for you the Middle East, but actually it is West Asia. And this is why really it's so good to be today with many also Asian colleagues and friends. The thesis I would like to start with is that Christian persecution is a Western construct that says more about the West than about the Christians of the Middle East. The perception, thus, this construct usually is that Christians in the Middle East are persecuted by Muslims. And I'm saying this is a perception rather than an actual description. And there is a politics actually that underlie it, which should not be underestimated. So that's my first thesis. The second thesis is that the politics surrounding the notion of Christian persecution has been leveraged by the West and by the Christian evangelical right to advance their own agenda. So they weren't really interested in the Christians themselves, but in their own agenda, especially their Islamophobe one. The Christians of the Middle East have been living for 14 centuries with Muslims. which is really a big difference than in the West, where Muslims came late as guest workers with another cultural and religious background. Living together wasn't always easy, but there was always a sense of belonging. And my third thesis that I would like to start with is that Western empires were really never interested in the Middle Eastern Christian, but sought a pretext to promote their imperial interests. Over and over again, Middle Eastern Christians were sacrificed on the altar of Western national interests. And here I would like to give 3 examples. The first example is from Lebanon. Lebanon 1860 was an important year in the memory of the Lebanese people. At that time, the structure in Lebanon was very much feudal, and there was always problems between and within the different communities on Mount Lebanon. But especially on Mount Lebanon, there were 2 major groups, the Druze community and the Maronite community. That year, 1860, over 20,000 Maronite Christians were massacred, mainly by Druze. Now, actually, it was the Christian who started that fight. It wasn't the Druze. But however, it's interesting to see how the Western media have portrayed the Druze, and here I have just one quote, as animals, and the Christians as victims. Interestingly enough, it was the British who were arming the Druze, because the Druze were the allies of Britain, while France adopted the Maronite as their allies, thus strengthening the sectarian identities of the region. And this is a recurring theme in the book. It's strengthening the sectarian identities by Western powers. So this is a quote from an English newspaper at that time about what happened in Lebanon in 1860. So it says the Christians were being hunted down like wild beasts, their houses fired, their men slain, their women violated. Even from the mosques and minarets, the shout for blood arose, and mingled with the muezzin call to prayer might be heard a cry informing the faithful that by an imperial firman, the Christians were devoted to destructions and their wives and properties have become a lawful prey. So this is actually written by a British journalist at a time when the British were actually supporting the Druze. And you can see actually all the pattern here in this quote that we can see throughout the last century until today, how basically Islamophobic language goes into this quote, and how the Christians are portrayed as victims and the Muslims here as wild beasts. Now, it's interesting if we look how the Christians in the region were portraying it. And here I would like to, in the book, I'm highlighting one very important, actually, Arab thinker, a Lebanese, Boutros el-Bustani. He was one of the first Protestant converts in the Middle East, a scholar whose response to these problems, which he saw as a civil war, was rather than a massacre. So he portrayed it as a civil war, not as a massacre, addressing both his people, both Druze and Maronites, saying, you drink the same water, you breathe the same air, the language you speak is the same, and so are the ground you tread, your welfare and your customs. You may still be intoxicated from drinking your compatriots' blood or disoriented by the calamities you have suffered, but very soon you must wake up from the stupor and realize the meaning of my advice and where your welfare lies. This was part of documents he was publishing under the name The Clarion of Syria. So you can see that while the West actually was trying to paint a sectarian picture of what was happening, the Christians of the region, in this case Boutros al-Bustani, was really interested about the unity rather than about the sectarian identities. The second example, again, I'm taking some very well-known examples and important examples in our history just to show my case. The second example from the Armenian genocide. Between 1880 and 1917, over 1.5 million Armenians and Assyrians were killed by Turkish nationalists. Here, it's important to realize that Armenian identity is both religious and national. It was the Turkish nationalism blended with Islam that collided with the Armenian identity, leading to the genocide. This was here, I would say, a clear case of persecution. However, interestingly enough, at that time, it was the Germans who were the allies of the Ottoman Empire and who were well aware of the genocide and were ordered not to interfere so as not to affect the German Ottoman alliance of World War I. So the German Empire, if you want, was aware of what was happening to the Armenians, but they did not interfere. This is strange when one considers the fact that Emperor William II was not only a pious Christian who saw himself as an emperor entrusted with the Holy Roman Empire, but as the King of Prussia, he was also the head of the German Protestant Church. So how did the head of the German Church side with the Ottoman Turks against fellow Christians? Why did he not only remain silent, but allow genocide of such magnitude to take place? Interestingly enough, the emperor gave clear instruction to his generals, and here I quote from one of his letters, not to interfere in Turkey's internal affairs. This prohibition extended to the Armenian question. The German ambassador in Istanbul, Baron von Wagenheim, gave an explanation for this German stance, writing, Germany must be especially careful not to antagonize the Turkish government. Otherwise, we run the risk of jeopardizing our goals in Turkey, our national interests. And when asked to indicate displeasure to the Turkish over the Armenian genocide, the German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, made it clear, our only aim is to keep Turkey on our side until the end of the war, no matter whether as a result Armenians do perish or not. So again, here, to say that Europe or the West are really interested in the plight of the Christians of the region, I think is a myth. A third example from Palestine. Following First World War, the two empires, as you know, Britain and France, dismantled the Ottoman Empire and divided the region between them, creating a mandate construct to suit the interest of the superpower in a sectarian fashion. Lebanon was designed as a country with a Maronite majority. Syria was divided into 4 sectarian provinces, 2 Sunnis, 1 Alawites, 1 Druze. Palestine was declared a Jewish homeland. With this, they created the notion of a minority as a reason for interference. In fact, it was at the Paris Peace Conference that for the first time, this issue of minority and minority protection was really highlighted. Minoritization and persecution of minority became 2 sides of the same medal. So once you start seeing the region as minority and majority, already there, you start creating a sectarian problem. And this is really what happened in Palestine. The Christian Zionists in England were eager to settle the European Jews in Palestine. To that end, the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, promising Palestine as a homeland to the Jews, though the Jews made less than 5% of the population. The rights of the indigenous people, both Christians and Muslims, were not taken into consideration. Again, we see here the sectarian politics at play. For example, should be 1928, the British divided the Jerusalem municipality into two, a Jewish and an Arab. 1947, they wanted to have two states along ethno-religious lines. And that year, 47-48 is really important because in that year, three projects were engineered by the British. The division between India and Pakistan, again, along those lines. In South Africa, the apartheid system became the official state policy, and Israel as a Jewish state. We look actually 1948, the creation of the State of Israel, displacement of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, including 50,000 Christians. Until this moment, Western are taking side with Israel, and they don't actually give any attention to the Palestinian Christians. So the whole, Britain, etc., France were doing their actually sectarian policy, while the Christians were fighting against sectarianism and Western hegemony at the same time by advocating for a united Syria, for example, based on a kind of Arab socialism. While Palestinian Christian intellectuals were fighting against the same Western hegemony represented by Zionism. I will skip these two Arab thinkers who were talking about that. The 50s and 60s saw the rise of Arabism, an exclusive political kind of Arab nationalism that proved to be hostile to the diversity in the Arab world. The multi-ethnic fabric was damaged when Greeks, Jews, and other religious groups left the Arab world. And this nationalization effort in Egypt and Iraq, actually in Syria to some extent, left many churches and well-to-do Christians without their institutions. So here it wasn't really the West that was harming the diversity, but it was the leaders and the political ideology in the post-colonial era, if we can call it at all post-colonial. And then when after the Iranian Revolution and when petroleum became a weapon, and both Saudi Arabia and Iran started to export their version of Islam, Christians actually started opening dialogue center. That was the case in Palestine, the case in Lebanon, the case in Syria, and in many other states. So again, Christians trying actually to work for unity rather than the sectarian identity, this time fueled by Saudi Arabia and Iran. And yet, and this is my, I come slowly to the end, it was the evangelicals in the US who created the concept of Christian persecution as a central theme in their teaching and promoted it in Congress with some success. Up until 1991, the Soviet Union was the focal point for the evangelical movement. Evangelicals were busy smuggling Bibles into the atheist and communist Russia, where the church had to exist underground and new believers were persecuted. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union caused a tectonic shift and forced the evangelicals to rethink their focus and strategy. For the last 3 decades, evangelicals have driven the agenda of Christian persecution. With the help of their Republican representatives, they have dictated US legislations that favor their version of international human rights with a narrow focus on Christian persecution. The election of President Trump and his evangelical vice president in 2016 brought the issue of Christian persecution back into focus. In fact, Vice President Pence made this one very important focus of his time. The well-known Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish wrote a poem under the title, "They Love Me Dead." This poem referred to the Arab world that portrays Palestinians as martyrs. The best-selling picture of a Palestinian in the Arab world is that of a Palestinian killed by an Israeli occupation forces. In the same way, we can say that evangelical Christians love to see Middle Eastern Christians persecuted and slaughtered by Muslim violence. Such a story sells well with the base of the Christian right. It serves conservative Christian organization as a proven tool for fundraising. It helps some Middle Eastern Christians who target support, especially financial support from conservative Christian organizations. And last but not least, it feeds into Israeli propaganda that portrays Israel as a location where Christians are protected.
Dr. Mitri, another 2 minutes.
Yeah, I have the two last slides. So the status of Christians in the Middle East depends on a series of socio-political and economical challenges that face the region as a whole. It is not possible to consider the situation of Christians outside the more general context, one that is marked by the absence of modernity, political accountability, or economical stability. The immense challenges facing a region in turmoil, challenged by a colonial history, population explosion, high unemployment, mismanagement, weakened human security, outdated educational structure, weak legal systems, and climate change. The combination of these problems result in de-development. Under such conditions, the survival of the Christian community will continue to be a challenge. So these are really the challenges facing the region, including the Christian. Many Middle Eastern Christians throughout history have understood that they have no other option but to get involved in the national and regional struggle towards social and political transformation. The history of Middle Eastern Christians is therefore not so much one of persecution, but one of resilience. And this should be acknowledged. This is my main thesis. Over a period of 2 millennia, Middle Eastern Christianity survived one empire after the other by developing great elasticity in adjusting to changing context. Christians learned how to survive atrocities and how to resist creatively while maintaining a dynamic identity. So I stop here and I look forward to the feedback from my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitri. A fascinating correction of historical understanding in the Western world, and you've raised many questions, I'm sure, that many issues, I should say, that will lead to further discussion, both from our commentators and then from our participants. So thank you very much once again. So I now turn to Professor Ilan Pape. He's professor with the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter. He was formerly a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Haifa, the author of many books, including The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Modern Middle East, A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples, and Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Professor Pape is a distinguished historian who, since the release of pertinent government documents, British, Israeli, and in the early 80s, has one of those historians who has been rewriting the history of Israel's creation in 48 and that which followed. He is a prominent supporter of the one-state solution, envisaging one state for Palestinians and Israelis, and is one of the pioneers, if you like, that has helped the establishment of the movement for liberation from Nakba. Professor Pape, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Raheb, for an excellent presentation that leaves us with a lot of food for thought. And thank you to the MLN, as always, for organizing such an important, timely, and urgent topic of discussion, like so many of the other webinars we had, and hopefully those that we will have in the future. I really would like to comment through three major topics. I just have to keep an eye on the watch. In response to this excellent, comprehensive, and Joe, as you said rightly, revisiting of the genealogy of the term the persecutions of Christians in the Middle East, as Professor Raheb made so very clear, is a Western construct. And with so many of these Orientalist constructs is very far from describing accurately and faithfully either the reality in the past or the reality in the present. I think the first point I would like to add is to the issue of the relationship between evangelical Christianity and the modern Middle East. And definitely one of the negative fruits of this engagement has been very accurately described in this lecture in kind of pushing towards victimization or an alleged victimizations of Christians in the Arab world and in the Muslim world as a pretext to justify certain policies, usually aggressive policies, towards the Middle East as a whole or towards individual Middle Eastern countries in particular. And in this respect, I would like to remind ourselves of the very strong connection between evangelical Christianity, of course, not all evangelical Christianity, but important streams in evangelical Christianity and Zionism. I think this is a very important point. Zionism was an evangelical Christian project before it was a Jewish project. Long before Jewish intellectuals who were responding to two kinds of impulses, anti-Semitism on the one hand, and the rise of the new modern idea of nationalism on the other. Long before that happened, evangelical Christians were pushing forward the idea of the Jewish restoration to Palestine as a religious imperative that would bring or precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead. It began as a dogmatic faith issue, but very soon it was used also as a political justification to push London to try and tear from the Ottoman Empire areas which the greedy imperialist group of people sitting in London wished to annex to the British Empire. What really saved the Middle East throughout the 19th century from the translation of these greedy imperialist program was the fact that at the heart of the British policy making body was a notion that the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire is a bad thing that could lead to a total war in Europe, which in fact is what happened in the First World War. But the group of evangelical Christians who were talking about the restoration of the Jews were able to single out Palestine and at least the Eastern Mediterranean as an area which is beyond the usual strategic British thinking of the issue. And they fused together the evangelical idea with the imperialist impulse to expand British policy. And the moment you convinced enough people in London that a British Palestine and a Zionist Palestine is a British interest, a process began that was very difficult to stop, that in many ways ended in 1948 in the Nakba. It had various stations in it, and Professor Raheb mentioned the most important one, the Balfour Declaration. But it was a long process. So I think we should be aware that the same people who are crying out about persecution of Christians in the Arab world were the people who were pushing for the colonization of Palestine that ended with the ethnic cleansing of 1948, the ongoing ethnic cleansing since 1948. It's the same kind of ideological infrastructure that produced these horrific policies towards the Palestinians. And in many ways, the moment this evangelical Christianity in the United States allied itself to a more secular, neoconservative way of looking at the world, the fusion together of a neoconservative Americanism with evangelical Christianity on both sides of the Atlantic created the basic ideological justification for the attack on Iraq in 2003 and for most of the aggressive policies of the United States, aided by some Western countries, in particularly Britain, which ended in the massive killing of Muslims and Christians in countries which may have not had a great history of human rights or civil rights or democracy, but definitely did not have a history of such massive genocides and killings until this group of evangelical neoconservatives decided to use weapons of mass destruction in order to impose a new American world order on the Middle East in the name of both secular neoconservatism and ideological evangelical Christianity. So that's my first point. My second point is that, a very important point also raised by Professor Raheb, is the whole idea of sectarianism. Sectarianism, in many ways, is an Orientalist framework. There are, of course, sects, and there always were sects. There were always cultural groups, ethnic groups, religious groups. People in, especially in the Mashraq, as we call it, the Eastern Middle East, tended to live in a pluralistic society where you had all kinds of identities to which you subscribed. You could be a Maronite, a Christian, an Arab, and part of the Ottoman Empire. And you could be in Palestine, a Christian living in the same village with a Druze community, a Jewish community, and a Christian community. And as Osama Maqdisi, in his wonderful late book, The Ecumenical Framework, shows, these identities were not carved in stone, were usually much, as he calls it, porous. Namely, you could easily navigate through these identities in order to create coexistence, but a genuine coexistence, accepting the general civilization that was around you, which was Islamic civilization, sharing in many ways the same spiritual attitude to places, to natural places, to places of holiness, sharing each other festivities. We know how many Christians and Jews participated in the Nabi Rubin festivities, how many Muslims shared the Jewish festivities near the city, near the town of Safad. And we have so many examples where the rule was that the sectarian identity is just one part of your identity and the way you interpret reality and you interact with reality. In many ways, and Professor Raheb mentioned the clash between the Druze and the Maronite in the 1860s. Some of it was not just between Maronites and Druze. There was also socioeconomic issues there between landlords and farmers. And sometimes you would feel that when landlords, with the help of the empire, oppress farmers, it's not the religious identity of the farmers which matters, but the fact that they are farmers. And therefore, in 1834, Christians, Muslims, and Jews joined together in a rebellion against the Egyptian rulers who were very imposing heavy taxes on the population. So it's very important to rewrite the genealogy of that history of sectarian relationship and not fall into the trap that old and new American, especially Orientalists, would like us to accept a sectarianism as a very rigid collective identity that does not accept anyone and is willing to fight to death against another identity. The nation state that the colonial powers created in the Middle East after the First World War is the root of the violence.
Professor Pape, another 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, yeah.
Please.
Is the root of the problem, and not the fact that people have a very complex reality in which they live and let live with others. And I would like to end something about the future. This is a quote, and with this I would end, Joe. This is a quote from S.M. Mohanty, the philosopher, which I think represents very well the way we used to live in the Mashrak before colonialism, imperialism, and Zionism pitted and armed sects against the other, and how we hopefully will live in the future. And I will end with this quote from 1989. How do we negotiate between my history and yours? How would it be possible for us to recover our commonality? Not the ambiguous imperial humanist myth of our shared human attributes, which are supposed to distinguish us from animals, but more significantly, the imbrication of our various pasts and presents, the ineluctable relationship of shared and contested meanings, values, and material resources. It is necessary to assert our dense particularities, our lived and imagined differences, but could we afford to leave untheorized the question of how our differences are intertwined and indeed hierarchically organized? Could we, in other words, afford to have entirely different histories, to see ourselves as living and having lived in entirely heterogeneous and discrete spaces? And these are, of course, all rhetorical questions that I would leave all of us to ponder about and think about. Middle East, where a sect is one flower in a blessed field with many flowers, and not groups that imperialist interests can pit one against the other in order to serve neoconservative, neoliberal, and Zionist interests all over the Arab world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pape, for an illuminating set of comments, both about the Christian evangelical agenda and the true nature of sectarianism. Well, now, let me turn to our second commentator for this webinar, and that is Dr. Chandra Muzaffa, who over many years, decades, has served as both scholar and a public figure, and is a very significant contributor to public discourse on a range of issues. He's the president of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. His most recent academic position was as Nuruddin Sopia Professor of Global Studies at the Science University of Malaysia in Penang. He has published extensively on many issues, in particular civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, Malaysian society. He's the author and editor of more than 20 books in English and Malay. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Chandra Muzaffa to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Joe. It was such a great pleasure listening to Professor Mitri Raheb and also the commentary from my friend Ilan Pape. Both the lectures were rich in information, profound analysis, and illuminating in terms of building bridges between religions and cultures in a manner that does justice to the philosophical traditions that these religions and cultures emerge from. It has been a truly enlightening afternoon, because it's afternoon here in Malaysia, and I benefited a great deal. I enjoyed being a student once more in a very concrete sense to both these eminent scholars and to the wisdom that they shared with us. Joe and friends, I'm going to concentrate on three things in these brief comments, two substantive and one a sort of futuristic look at the relations between people of different communities and religions. In terms of the actual lecture and also the comments from Ilan Pape, which further illuminated some of the issues raised. There are 2 points I want to touch upon. One is the whole question of sectarianism as central to colonial ideology. And number 2, I would like to look at the challenge of dominance, of hegemony at this point in history, and how that challenge has become more complex and much more perilous, if you like, because of the role of religious forces. How the challenge of dominance, of hegemony has become much more complex because of the role of religious forces. And we can see that so clearly in the case of the politics of West Asia. Like Prof. Raheb, I'm also very averse to using the word Middle East because, that is an example of colonial thinking, the way in which the colonialists had looked at the world and named, labeled different parts of the world. I prefer to use the term West Asia. We're talking of the larger region, West Asia and North Africa, WANA, which I know that a couple of ministries of foreign affairs, they also use the term WANA and not the Middle East. Maybe Nakba, our movement, we should try to promote this using the right term, because Confucius had told us a long time ago that using the right term is vital in trying to understand issues. So the right terms for what we are witnessing today, this region that in some ways is the greatest challenge to humanity, West Asia and North Africa. Let me begin with my comments on sectarianism, beautifully elucidated in the lecture and very well elaborated by Ilan Pape. I want to sort of broaden this notion of sectarianism by bringing in Southeast Asia, which we haven't touched upon. This is also an example of sectarianism as promoted and expanded by the colonial powers. In the case of Southeast Asia, the major colonial powers were all involved, but in particular, as far as insular Southeast Asia is concerned, it was the British and the Dutch. And they achieved something in terms of sectarianism that is perhaps unparalleled in our part of the world. The people of Malay origin, the vast majority of people in Southeast Asia, Malays, the basic population of Indonesia and the majority population in Malaysia, also majority population in Little Brunei, and one of the major communities in Singapore. Now, large parts of this area that I've just described, the people who lived in this area, in the historical and geographical sense, and to a great extent in the cultural sense, they saw themselves as one people for ages. They interacted as a single people, and they were very concerned about certain issues of identity, but by and large, one of the most outstanding dimensions of that concern of identity was an inclusive notion of identity, which is the reason why they welcomed people from all parts of the world to insular Southeast Asia. There was no notion of narrow, bigoted, myopic community. It was not there. If such ideas emerged later, the colonial powers are partly responsible for the emergence of such ideas. But for the people of the region, for hundreds of years, it was a very inclusive notion of what people were. It was fluid, which is a word I would use to reinforce the term that has been used by Professor Raheb. The term that he had used was porous. I would say it is just very fluid in terms of the notion of identity. And people sort of moved in and out of identities in response to different situations. They borrowed from different cultures and histories. They were very comfortable with that sort of environment. Of course, there were problems here and there, which are recorded, but by and large, it was an amazing example of cosmopolitan culture in the real sense of the word. The Malay or Nusantara, as the term is used, culture in this part of the world. Who divided us politically? This region, Nusantara. It's done by the two colonial powers, the Dutch and the British, who divided Indonesia, the masters there were the Dutch, and Malaysia, the masters were the British. They divided them mainly through a treaty known as the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824, or the London Treaty, 1824. There was not a single person from insular Southeast Asia at that meeting that divided the people of this region. It was the Dutch and the British who decided that Indonesia and Malaysia would be divided. And they've remained divided. They've not been able to forge a single political identity since. And even attempts at forging a single political identity had been thwarted by not just outside powers, but also by groups within these two societies, like in the case of Malaysia. And I say this in a very frank and forthright manner, this idea of dividing the Malay world, Nusantara, into Indonesia and Malaysia to suit the colonial interests was supported by the Malay rulers in Malaysia. They supported this idea of dividing up these people, and the rulers claimed to be the rulers of the Malays in at least one part of this huge archipelago in Malaysia. They supported this because they knew that this would preserve their positions, given what had happened in Indonesia. As a result of the changes that had taken place in Indonesia, you find that the rulers could not hold the fort. They were wiped out by the powerful waves of history. Why? Because in Indonesia, the nationalist movement was led by the non-aristocrats. It was led by a rising middle class, which was firmly committed to republicanism, to the idea of a republic. In Malaysia, on the other hand, the ones at the forefront of the nationalist movement were the Malay rulers and aristocrats linked to them. They wanted to preserve their positions at all costs. And they knew that this division would help to preserve their positions, because what drove out the aristocrats and the feudal rulers was actually the nationalist movement. So what you had in Malaysia was a nationalist movement of sorts, but a very tame and mild nationalist movement, which was helmed by the aristocrats. And as a result of doing that, they preserved their positions. And they could do it because of the Anglo-Dutch Treaty. It preserved their position, which is why they supported this idea of Indonesia and Malaysia. And those who preached some other notion of unity, they were all set aside. Some were imprisoned, some were killed, but that was history. Now, the point I want to make is that sectarianism, from that point of view, in the political sense, has had a massive impact upon our region. And to add to this, in the case of Malaysia, the British, they strengthened identities with the aim of keeping people divided. Chinese and Indians, who came later as a result of colonial migration, and they were the products of colonial rule to some extent. Now, the Chinese and Indians, their sectarian identities were strengthened in all sorts of ways. In the case of the Indians, for instance, their very caste-based, extremely backward notions of identity, which in some instances were strongly challenged by Indian nationalism. But in the case of this offshoot of an Indian community in Southeast Asia, those identities were reinforced by the British by resurrecting practices from the past, the structure of power, the various social etiquettes that had developed. All those things were structured and resurrected to serve colonial interests. And they did the same thing with the Chinese. Chinese community had a history of cleanse and linguistic identities, but they were strengthened in such a way that they prevented a larger unity developing within the Chinese community, which would be able to interact with the other communities. And when there were signs that some sort of understanding was beginning to develop amongst the different communities, the Malays majority with a history of indigenous links, and the Chinese and the Indians, the British crushed those attempts. Later, when they wanted to leave and they had to give independence to Malaya, they went out of the way to play one community against the other. So they had fostered identities in a certain manner and played a different role, a contradictory role, just before independence to suit their interests. So what Prof. Raheb talked about in the context of West Asia is not unique to West Asia. It had happened wherever the colonial powers had set up their bases. And Malaysia, Indonesia, the whole region would be a very good example of this. I think this is something that we should keep in mind. And perhaps the new generation of scholars should look at how parallels of this sort had existed for a long while and how they impact upon our societies to this day. The type of community divisions that the British fostered and strengthened, they're still very much part of Malaysian society today. To some extent, they also exist in Indonesia, though the nationalist movement is strong enough in Indonesia to challenge some of those dichotomies.
Dr. Chandra, another 3 minutes.
Yes, I'm rounding up. So I think we have to keep this in mind, and very quickly, the new colonial or post-colonial experience, if I can in a couple of minutes state this, Iraq would be a very good example of how, even in terms of the divisions that had emerged in Iraq, in Lebanon, and other places, and how these things were exploited by the American colonialists and their partners, the British and others, and the French in various other parts of not just West Asia and North Africa, but also Sub-Saharan Africa. These attempts have continued for a very long while. And this, again, I think is an area where we can work together and see what these parallels mean to contemporary societies. There's no way we can understand the dominance and hegemony of today without looking at this past. To look at hegemony without a historical perspective is doing a great injustice to the communities that are suffering from the politics of hegemony. So I think that's something that we have to do. And that brings me to the last point I want to make, Joe. I think scholarship, since this is one dimension of our work here through Nakba, I think scholarship has to undergo a major transformation, where the categories we employ, the way in which we look at contemporary developments, including hegemony and the responses to hegemony and so on, we give prominence to these aspects of history and how they've shaped our thinking today. And this is a major challenge, because I find that when you interact with young people, that aspect of history is very often sidelined. In fact, there are some post-colonial historians in my country, and I know in Indonesia too, who argue that one should not talk too much about colonial history. One should concentrate on other things that are more real. But we don't realize that what gives strength to our contemporary realities is actually that past, and our ability to grapple with that past and to overcome its devastating impact. That is what will help shape our future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Chandra, and how welcome it was to hear from him tell us about parallels that have arisen as a result, parallels of divide and rule and sectarian politics that have arisen as a result of the imperial expansion of a number of European powers from the 18th and 19th centuries onwards. Okay, well, now we come to the opportunity for participants to pose some questions. If any of you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. Don't rely on the chat function to pose your questions, because I'm looking at the Q&A board to see what issues are being raised in order to relay them to our speakers. At the moment, we have two questions, and there is considerable similarity between them, and I'll turn to them in one moment. But I did want to use the moderator's privilege and ask a question of Professor Raheb, and it's this. How would you describe where the Christian communities in the Arab world, or West Asia, as Dr. Chandra refers to it, where do they stand now? What is their self-perception at this time of what has transpired historically and where they're situated right now? Is there a common perspective, or are there widely different views representing different parts of the Christian community in this part of the world?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joe. The Christian community in West Asia and North Africa is not homogeneous. It has been from day one, actually, pluralistic. And this is actually important to realize the difference between Christianity as developed in this region, say, versus Europe. In Europe, because of the empire, there was one major church that developed, which is the Catholic Church. It took 1500 years for the Protestant then to bring a new notion within that one solid church. But here in our region, the Christian gospel actually was always in dialogue and interaction with the culture and with the different identities. So in Egypt, there was a Coptic church that developed. In Lebanon, a Maronite church. In Iraq, an Assyrian church, etc. So the local flavor of not nationalism in the new sense, but of heritage, actually was able to bring in you a genuine blend of Christianity for that region. That was suppressed by the empire because the emperor wanted always to have one Christianity with one creed, and he has a problem. Always, empire has a problem with this kind of diversity, and so until today we have these different plans, but also within these different plans there are different movements. There are movements who are more maybe exclusive, conservative in nature, and you have more movements that more liberal in nature in all of these churches. And because Christians are part of the whole society, so they are influenced. In one of my books on the Arab Spring, for example, I showed how Christians were, across the board you could find them, from being on the streets, marching for freedom, for dignity, etc., and those siding with those in power, and everything in between. So you can see actually, these different blends of Christianity and of Christians here as well.
Well, let me turn then to the first question, which comes from Leila Pasa, who is from the question is speaking from the Indian experience. The question is, given the Islamophobic trends in various parts of the world, including South Asia, can art and culture be used to promote unity amongst communities, including the Arab world? How can the rich cultural heritage of the Arab world be brought to bear on the sectarianism which has been so powerfully manipulated by outside forces? So perhaps it goes to you first, and then our commentators, Professor Raheb, and then our two commentators can add anything they may wish to.
Yeah, you know, as a founder and president of the first and only university in Palestine that focus on arts and culture, not on theology, I have to say definitely art and culture play an important role. Because first of all, arts and culture, actually they provide a kind of a common ground, a new language, if you want, because sometimes I feel language is already occupied. Because the media all the time actually perpetuate this sectarianism, etc. Now, arts and culture provide an open space for people to articulate themselves in a language that is not occupied, if you want. And for me, that is amazing. I mean, in the 80s, late 80s, and the 90s, I was very much involved in interfaith dialogue. But with time, I felt, you know, this interfaith became boring because you ended up with the same, you know, 7 shaykhs and 7 theologians and 7 rabbis, and, you know, you were massaging each other, you know, religiously. And you didn't feel that, you know, there is a new movements coming out. With the students now, you know, working with films and with paintings and with music, articulating who they are and what their desires are, I see a new generation actually who are contributing to a more colorful region. If I went to use Professor Pape's with the, you know, image of the flower, you know, that colorful region is really important, and we need this colorfulness in a time when everything seems to be so, you know, one kind of thinking, of one color, etc. Maybe here I will stop to give my colleagues possibilities to add.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Raheb. Does either Professor Pape or Dr. Chandra wish to add a comment here?
Yes, if I may. There were 2 parts to the question. One, a general one of how do we challenge it, and one more specifically, the role of art and culture in such a challenge. So let me say, first of all, about the more general aspect of it. I have to say there's a new generation of researchers, including in the West, who are looking at the history of West Asia, as we mentioned it, or the east part of the Mediterranean, and are challenging, first of all, sectarianism in general, but also these particular topics that we are talking about. So I think we should be hopeful and aware of the fact that a younger generation of academics who choose to look at these topics, maybe unlike the previous generation, are not just doing it because they are looking for an academic career. They are also doing it because it's very close to their heart, morally, politically, ideologically. And this new trend that we can see in humanities and social sciences of activism fused together with scholarship is one that promises that also in the production of academic knowledge, we will see in the future far more sensitive, far more reflective analysis of these issues, whether people would be writing on the past or on the present. So this is generally speaking, I think we should be really aware of it and be hopeful about it, and of course strengthen this orientation, because the flip side of it is that governments, and especially in public universities, don't like this trend and are doing all they can to prevent it. As for culture and art, of course, it's a very important issue, and I'm glad Leila raised it, especially for the younger generation, where an academic article or an academic monograph is not exactly the only way in which people learn about the past or the present, and especially the way documentary films, feature films, plays, even musicals have in the past conveyed a certain narrative which was Orientalist, which was racist, which was distorting the reality, a counter representation of these issues through any kind of medium is very, very important. And again, one should note the work of young artists in the Arab world, playwrights, filmmakers, who are introducing through the various media which they specialize in this new genealogy that we are talking about. And I think this should be encouraged and continued, because these popular cultural venues are usually still dominated by mega production companies like Netflix, Hollywood, and so on, who still subscribe to a narrative which I think most of us would totally object to. So we need to find the means and the ways of countering this hegemonic narrative, and provide also a popular way of sharing these ideas that we are talking about here today.
Thank you. Chandra, did you want to add anything?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, the next question comes from Steve Liddell, and he raises this very interesting, fascinating, complex question. Given that we are discussing, we have discussed, or our speakers have discussed, the problem of divide and rule used as a weapon by imperial power, and obviously used with very unfortunate but real effect. Is there not another aspect of, if you like, the evangelical agenda, which has to do with its understanding, with the definition of secular, which is itself problematic? And so Steve asks, how can we break this outdated philosopher, I beg your pardon, this outdated philosophy of what is secular, which prevents not just ecumenism, but also self-determination. Secular to be not just so that it's not non-religious or even anti-religious, but something deeper and more humane. I suppose that's what Steve is asking. Is that a major issue that needs to be taken up? A major, if you like, definitional approach of the evangelical worldview, which needs to be seriously questioned. The view of the secular. Who would like to come in and address that?
Professor Pape, maybe?
Yes, okay. I'm waiting for you, Mitri, to see whether you wanted to go first on this complex issue. Steve, thank you. I think you raise an important question here, and all these terms you know, Chandra mentioned Confucius' warning about the importance of how terms really define our world and our attitude to the world. This whole term is, in the context of the conversation we have, is imposed by the West on a certain reality in West Asia or in the Arab world. And very much so that when this concept was adopted as part of a process of modernization by local political elite, it was used quite often as means of kind of creating a better relationship with the powers that be, whether they were colonial powers or neo-colonial powers, and created what they thought the West liked to see as a secular model, which again did not interact and always reflect well the very complex, sensitive, what I called earlier the ecumenical frame, if you want, of the mosaic and fabric of the multi-ethnic and multi-plural Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean in that respect. So I think, yes, revisiting not only the concept, but the way it was adopted and interpreted, giving into account that this was in many ways imposed from the West. First of all, in the early stages when these ideas were introduced, but even more important when it becomes even more brutal when there is this constant belief that you can impose by force either secularization or what the Western countries call democracy through bombing countries and invading them with Western military power. In this respect, I would like to mention, since Steve mentioned it, the work of the late Albert Hurani and his brilliant book, Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, 1839 to 1939. Albert Hurani, who I was fortunate enough to be his student at the University of Oxford many, many years ago, was born in Beirut, but at the age of 1, moved to Manchester, Britain. And from that perspective, he was able to look at the way thought developed in this meeting point between Western imperialism and colonialism on the one hand, and internal dynamics of change in the Eastern Mediterranean on the other. And one of the things that he brings to light in his analysis is the moments in which people on the ground who are scholars or thinkers or religious leaders are willing to take new ideas that come from the outside, fuse them together with their own understanding of reality, with their own heritage, with their own legacy, and creating something originals of their own based on this infusion. And I think this is where we should look for the meanings of secularism, religion, multiculturalism, not as construct that you buy in a supermarket of ideas in the West, but rather things that have a dynamic development and keep being thought of and redefined by the people themselves in relationship to the reality in which they live. And you know, this is so true of other issues that are very important for people who live in the area, whether these are gender issues, even gay rights issues, all these issues, if they are imported by force from the outside, with a certain culture, with a certain attitude that is totally insensitive to the way people live, to their legacies, to their heritage, to their value systems, it creates unnecessary clashes and does not only not improve reality, it usually aggravates it. And I think this is where I would, if I understood correctly your question, Steve, would talk about it.
Can I add maybe just 2 sentences?
Sure.
To that? I think historically speaking, you know, the year 1967 was a devastating year for our region. Not because, you know, Israel took over just the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai and Golan, but because in that year, and I have a chapter in the book that talks about that, in that year we see Jewish Messianism mushrooming, Christian Zionism, because Christian Zionists saw God fighting on the side of Israel against all of these Arab worlds, and you know, the whole notion of political Islam that came. And I think all these 3 meant a blow to any, you know, any of the like secular ideas that were there in the Arab world were basically crushed because of what happened in 1967. And so I see 1967 as being, it's the, if you want, the Americanization of religion. It was suddenly this American blend that actually took over the region, and religion started to mean something totally different from what it used to mean before. And so I think with this question, the year 1967 is important. Now, there are, I mean, following what's happening today in our region, among the young people, we did a study some years ago about the young people, and we saw something very interesting. The young people today are either very religious or they don't want anything to do with religion. There isn't much in the middle anymore. And these who do not want to have anything with religion, as a pastor, I'm happy that they are there, because I think they are challenging this notion of religion that developed after 1967. And I see new ideas of secular ideas that are popping up again in our region among the young people. In Egypt, they tell me atheism is spreading. I don't think really it's atheism in its Western concept, but it is people who are saying, you know, we really don't want to do anything with this blend of religion that developed after 1967. And so I think this will be one struggle in the coming years to see how this will develop.
Okay, well, I think we should really bring the webinar to some conclusion soon, but let me nevertheless give expression to two more questions as briefly as I can summarize them, and any of our three speakers can address one or the other. One is simple in its formulation, but of course itself always complex. We've spoken about the possible role of art and culture. The question is, do you feel there is also a place for mathematics and science to play a constructive role? That's one question. The other question comes based in part on the Pakistan experience, where the question of the persecution of Christians has also been highly politicized. The question, though, points to this. Nevertheless, there is sometimes from Muslim quarters an utterly reactionary response. In a sense, these circles buy into the propaganda of Christians and in a sense become fifth columnists of empire. Do such problems occur elsewhere? And if so, what are possible strategies to overcome them? There's a nice big question to complete the discussion for this webinar. Who would like to address either of those two questions? Don't all speak at the same time.
I'll make just one comment about the second question. Hopefully the other two speakers will be willing to comment on the first one. Does it happen elsewhere? In many ways? Well, I think that since the globalization has become such an intensive and powerful process in our life, the idea that a certain reality is confined to one place doesn't work anymore. And because we are reopening definitions, when we are reopening genealogies, that is histories that we thought we had accepted narratives, accepted versions of them, we are faced with a realization that what we once thought could be defined or confined to one region is actually a problem that has a global dimension. I will give just one example, and I hope this somehow relates to the question. I will take the issue of colonialism and decolonization as a good example. Until recently, when you dealt with this topic as an academic or as a journalist or as a writer, you would have thought that there was the colonizer world and the colonized world, and these were two distinct geographical entities, and therefore decolonization could only take part in the previously colonized world, and decolonization was not a relevant term to what happened in the colonizers' world. So decolonization is something that occurs in Africa, but does not occur in Britain or in the United States. We have moved away from these distinctions. We believe that the way neoliberal elites and structures treat their workers, the way political and cultural elites treat minorities, whether these are indigenous minorities or immigrant minorities, and so on, are not that dissimilar to colonialism. And it's a kind of a new version of colonialism, and in some cases even settler colonialism, that affects our societies wherever we are. And therefore, decolonization is not just getting the French out of Algeria, it is also restructuring the French society in a way that decolonizes the basic value system, the basic attitudes that such a society has towards the other. This is true about the United States. This is definitely true about Britain, that still is a colonial space towards the people who live there, not just the people it colonized in the past. And therefore, these discussions can never be confined to one historical period or to one geographical space. They have to do a lot with the way we value human rights and civil rights, and we expose their either very sophisticated or very simple violation, but taking into account that these are long historical processes that have their own histories and justification. And in order to unpack them, we should see the commonalities in all these attitudes and not think that there is an exceptionalism here, either in the world of the victimizers or in the world of the victims for that purpose. And therefore, such intersectionality can also enhance the solidarity of the groups that should work together for a decolonized world in the 21st century.
Thank you, Professor Pape. Anyone else wants to comment on either question? Okay, well, I think it's time, as I was saying, to bring this fascinating webinar to some conclusion. I don't want to spend much time adding any comments, except one, which we have handled to some extent, but which probably can do with much more in-depth discussion. I think basically we have seen how religion has been used for, if we can put it this way, malignant purposes, how it has been used to divide, to segment, and to marginalize, and how that then has had all kinds of foreseeable and unforeseen effects, which linger on in many societies, both of the colonized and the colonizers. The question I have is, does religion have it within its power, within its capacity to rise to the challenge and take head on this weaponization of religion and shift the focus? And when I say religion, I'm thinking here specifically of the three Abrahamic faiths. Can religion rise to the challenge of the moment? And better still, can the different religious traditions attempt to do so, preferably together in dialogue with each other? To what extent then is this, do we see any evidence of this happening in some of these troubled parts of the world, but also within the West, as well as with the former colonized world? I think this is a question we've touched upon, but I think it does bear a good deal of further thought and discussion, and indeed further action, but that is for another day. The MLN is very much committed to having further webinars and is discussing and planning for more, so please stay tuned. I'd like to thank all our participants for sharing in this afternoon's, evening's, morning's deliberation. And I hope it will provide further food for thought and even action in the months and years to come. And of course, a very special thanks to those who've helped to make this webinar possible, in particular to Hassanal and to Ranjan, who have contributed a great deal behind the scenes in making this event the success that I think it has been. And finally, a very sincere thanks to Professor Raheb, to Professor Pape, and to Dr. Chandra. We are deeply indebted to all three of you for your insights, your wisdom, and your passion for a better, more just, and more humane future than the past or for that matter, the present. I thank you all and look forward to seeing you all again at MLN in the not too distant future. Goodbye and good health to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Joe. Thank you everyone for coming. So the recording will be on YouTube for anyone who wants to see. Join us for our next event. We will be announcing it in our Facebook page and in our future channels. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to all the participants and thank you to all the panelists. We'll see you again next time in our next webinar. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye, bye, bye.